But Christianity makes bold historical claims, none bigger than the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection wasn't a whispered legend. It was publicly proclaimed right after Jesus' death in Jerusalem, the very place it happened. The apostles didn't just preach it, they preached it under hostile scrutiny, risking torture and execution. People don't willingly suffer and die for something they know is a lie.
Irrelevant testimony, entirely irrelevant.
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where we examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how with education, rationality, and reason we can bridge the societal divides that they create. As you can see, this week's video will be a little different. I tweaked my back while doing some work around the house, and it's made sitting at my desk for long periods rather difficult. So to save time, I won't be on camera for this one. Hopefully, the dulcet tones of my voice alone will suffice. Today, we're taking a look at a video put out by apologist Erik Manning over on his channel Testify. For those unfamiliar with Erik, he's one of those apologists who counts himself among the former atheist club, and the style of his content falls in the category of his voice over various edited images and troll memes. Erik also runs the Is Jesus Alive website, where he's collected all of his various arguments and presents the claims of the Bible as if they are known facts, and his various social media musings have gotten him featured on apologetic sites such as Frank Turek's Cross-Examined, Cameron Bertuzzi's Capturing Christianity, and J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity. Now in this video, titled You're Not Supposed to Exist If Atheism is True, Erik proceeds to try and make the case that if atheism is rationally justified, which it is, then it is logically entailed that individual experience itself could not exist. But despite his title being both an obvious straw man of atheism and an obvious non sequitur, let's hear exactly what this personification of wojakiphile is attempting to express to his audience of around 188,000 subscribers. Take it away, Erik.
Let's talk about something so obvious we miss how weird it really is.
Let's do that. Let's talk about how in this day and age, over 70% of the planet's population is convinced that some form of a god entity exists and that everyone around them should believe that too, often to the extent that they will utilize predatory emotional and psychological manipulation, legislation, and even violence to force others how to live just to validate their own lives, despite their total inability to demonstrate that such an entity actually exists to do all the things they think it does, and that all their argumentation for the existence of such an entity is completely fallacious, thus rendering their position as utterly irrational. I do think it's pretty obvious how weird this is.
You're conscious. You're not just reacting to stuff like a rock rolling downhill. You're aware. You experience the world.
By addressing the concepts of awareness and experience, I can see that we're treading towards some very deep philosophical waters. But before we get too involved, I'm curious how exactly this subject relates to the title of your video. Unless, of course, this is the first red flag that your title was just intended to function as clickbait to draw in the less philosophically educated.
You think about your future. You worry about finals. You wonder whether this video will change your mind.
More like I'm wondering if what you're about to bring up will actually address the concept that I think you're about to bring up with any degree of intellectual honesty, or if you, like so many other apologists, are just going to gloss over the important details so that you can push a particular narrative.
You know that you're you.
And already you've skipped over a major philosophical point. Can we say for an absolute fact that the perception we have of our individual self, or what Descartes labels as the I in the cogito, is itself not a projection from Descartes' hypothetical evil demon? The reality is there currently is no independent mechanism by which we can differentiate between our subjective internal experience and what we ostensibly call objective reality or absolute truth. As Descartes articulated, while we can confirm at minimum that an experience is being had simply by the fact that the experience itself can be doubted, we cannot currently state that the experience of what we call the self is itself an absolute fact, and as such we hold to the proposition that it is actually the I that is having the experience axiomatically. Now some will argue that such questioning is just a form of radical skepticism that contradicts what we call Moorean facts or common sense statements, and yet others will point out that not acknowledging such questions can potentially create an illusion of justification, oftentimes for some pretty wacky conclusions, such as the one Erik is expressing in the title of his video, that if people truly did not believe in the existence of a god or gods, you, and by you I assume he means the subjective experience of self, cannot exist.
Oh, Daryl, that's just silly.
Here's the problem. According to atheistic naturalism, None of this was supposed to happen.
And that's mistakes number 2 and 3.
Hold on to your butts.
First, we have to address the predatory intellectual dishonesty here. No doubt we're all very familiar with the apologist strategy of invoking highly complex and diverse topics, such as the numerous philosophical positions that compose a comprehensive worldview, only to then intentionally represent those topics in a wildly reductive manner just so they can push a particular point in their narrative. Erik's reductive framing of the discourse here through the use of the term atheistic naturalism as if it represents a comprehensive worldview is a prime example of this. He has deliberately used these two highly specific terms in this video for 2 reasons. One, so he can focus the conversation onto 2 specific propositions while simultaneously ignoring every other surrounding position, just so he can manufacture scenarios in which the non-believer appears to be committing a logical fallacy, such as begging the question or affirming the consequent. And 2, so he can set the foundation for dishonestly implying that the position of atheism itself logically entails the position of naturalism, which it certainly does not. Atheism and naturalism, while both deal with one's epistemological standard, are 2 distinct philosophical positions whose focus are completely different topics. Not believing in the existence of a god or gods, or the justification for a personal position of lacking belief, and the position that all that exists is nature, natural phenomena, and natural explanations, or the justification for claims about perceived independent external reality. A position, by the way, if the goal is to maintain logical consistency, that should not be first assumed, but should in fact be concluded as being a result of the evidence and the application of the principles of parsimony, as well as because the term supernatural really amounts to nothing more than a label that is applied only in the context of a particular phenomenon currently being unexplainable by known natural means. A label that has been historically and contemporarily demonstrated to be swiftly dropped when the phenomenon in question is explained later on. I point to the litany of naturalistic phenomena and debunked miracles throughout human history as evidence of this. Second, the statement that none of this was supposed to happen implies that intentionality is somehow a necessary prerequisite for the existence of nature. But there is a world of difference between logical possibility and probability. For one, there is no logical or physical contradiction in everything we currently observe being the result of purely unguided naturalistic processes, and 2, given that we only have access to one universe and one world, and that world has life on it capable of awareness, without multiplying our entities unnecessarily, the probability of such a phenomenon occurring currently stands at 100%. Implying that intentionality is somehow required is just an argument from personal incredulity.
On naturalism, everything starts from unconscious matter, just particles bouncing around in a godless void. That's the foundation. No mind, no meaning, no purpose, just atoms and physics.
A bit reductive, but sure, as far as we can measure back to the Planck time, matter is a result of work being done. There is no logical issue with this. But don't forget, even if an agent were to exist and at some point were involved in the mechanistic process, the agent itself would still be a thing that exists in the universe and has its own mind, so the mechanism by which it does anything would still be explainable by naturalistic means. The only reason theists are forced to appeal to the supernatural or magic and mystery or faith is simply a result of their inability to demonstrate that such an entity actually exists.
So here's the question. Why would that kind of universe randomly cough up you?
Well, you're technically asking 2 questions here, Erik. The first is how, mechanistically speaking, my physical form in the universe came to be, and that's simply because my parents smashed.
Bow chicka bow wow.
And the second is how, mechanistically speaking, my sense of identity, or the JL, came to be. And that's explained by a combination of my genetics, the nature, and the sum total of the experiences I've had in my life, the nurture, that have influenced the development of my neural pathways.
Consciousness isn't just one more physical process to throw under a microscope.
Are you completely certain about that? Or is that just a statement you're making out of an appeal to emotion? The overwhelming desire to stave off existential dread by desperately clinging to the irrational belief that we humans are really something more than what we appear or can be demonstrated to actually be.
It's not like digestion or photosynthesis. It's first-person experience.
Which itself, just like digestion and photosynthesis, can be described as an emergent property of functioning biological systems. The question is, are you justified in claiming that the phenomenon of consciousness is anything more than that beyond an argument from personal incredulity?
And no matter how many neurons you map or circuits you model, you'll never get I feel sad or I love my mom out of electricity.
True, you don't get those concepts out of neuronal firing alone. You get them out of the functioning brain structures responsible for the expression of those emotions. Neuronal firing is what facilitates the functioning and communication between those structures.
There is a huge chasm between firing neurons and feeling anything at all. Even atheist philosophers admit this is a massive problem.
Here we go.
The chasm and massive problem that he's referring to, as first formulated by cognitive scientist David Chalmers in 1995, is called the hard problem of consciousness. Essentially, Chalmers identified a gap in our understanding of how the purely physical functions in our brains translate to our subjective internal experiences of those functions, or what academic philosopher and logician Clarence Irving Lewis dubbed in 1929 qualia. And this is where things get really muddy. In philosophy, an individual's internal state in regards to a statement is referred to as a propositional attitude. Propositional attitudes are often treated as fundamental units of thought, and the contents of those attitudes, being propositions, are true or not true from the perspective of the person. Examples of this would be, Sally hoped that she had won the debate, or Sally believed that she had won the debate. Qualia, however, stands in stark contrast to this, as it is focused on what it is directly like to be experiencing. Examples of this would be the redness of red, the taste of ice cream, or the pain of a headache. The primary issue here is that the term qualia, being a philosophical term and not a scientific one, has no singular definition to denote exactly what it is referring to in theory of mind. And seeing as how qualia cannot be fully conveyed verbally nor demonstrated directly in an argument, all we really have to rely on are thought experiments that are designed to lead to the conclusion that qualia exist. So the question then becomes, is qualia even really a thing that we can reference in the pursuit of what is most likely to be true about external reality? Nonetheless, all this exploration of the mind led Chalmers to ask the question at the core of the issue: why do the physical processes of the brain feel like anything at all? For Chalmers, the hard problem denotes that subjective internal experience simply cannot be reduced to mere physical brain states. As a result of this, he argues that there has to be something more, something potentially beyond the physical, call it whatever you want, that was responsible for what we call experience. And other philosophers such as Nagel, Bloch, Jackson, Tye, and Kripke have jumped on board with their own work on the idea. But Chalmers' position has also led to a number of rebuttals from other philosophers and cognitive scientists such as Daniel Dennett, George Ray, and Keith Frankish, who all in their own ways pretty much argue that Chalmers' qualia concept does way more heavy lifting than is warranted by the available evidence. Basically, that the problem that he is presenting only exists as a direct result of specific assumptions he's making about the ontological nature of experience. To put a fine point on it, the hard problem of consciousness only really exists if it is the case that mind-body dualism is true. Because if monism is true, the position that reality is composed of a single substance, being either physical or mental, the hard problem simply ceases to exist. All of that aside, the important thing to remember is that despite our deep understanding of the correlative and causative relationships between the physical brain and experience, the only reason the question exists at all is because we don't currently have a nuanced mechanistic explanation for how the physical functions of the brain directly translate into that subjective experience. But that gap in our current understanding is certainly no justification for an appeal to the supernatural.
Colin McGinn famously asked, how did evolution convert the water of biological tissue into the wine of consciousness?
The obvious Christian allusion in that quote aside, I wouldn't say Colin McGinn would be the best philosopher for you to cite here, Eric. Whether that be because his position of new Mysterianism, the total cop-out position that the human mind is simply incapable of solving the hard problem of consciousness, is based entirely on specific assumptions that he is also making regarding the ontological nature of experience, or because he resigned his tenured position at the University of Miami after being accused of sexual harassment by a graduate student, and then proceeded to blame the whole of academia for his subsequent cancellation and his resulting inability to secure another position, is entirely up for you to decide.
So let's be real, if naturalism is true, if all that exists fundamentally is non-conscious matter governed by blind physical laws, then consciousness is not something that you would expect.
And that's just a non sequitur. If we don't multiply our entities unnecessarily, meaning that we don't make unnecessary assumptions about the ontological nature of experience like Chalmers and McGinn do, if we work bottom up with the evidence we can actually demonstrate that we have access to, then there is nothing in nature to indicate that qualia could simply not be an emergent property of the functions of our brain. Essentially just a label that we give to our private, inaccessible personal feelings. There's no logical or physical contradiction there, and just because we currently lack a comprehensive mechanistic understanding of the process doesn't indicate that there isn't one or that we won't ever be able to discern it. And it must be noted that future generations of AI may help us with that endeavor.
You might expect complex behavior, information processing, maybe even robots that pass Turing tests. But subjective experience, the inner what it's like to be you, has no place in that picture.
That also is not a justifiable conclusion given what I previously stated. The situation is basically this. We have a data set that we call Qualia. We have experimentally confirmed that there is a correlative relationship between Qualia and the physical brain, that specific experiences map to specific structures in the brain, and we have confirmed that there is a causative relationship between Qualia and the physical brain, that specific experiences are contingent upon specific structures in the brain functioning within the range of what we call typical norms. We, however, do not currently have a mechanistic explanation for how our physical processes translate directly into our qualia, but that doesn't mean that there isn't one. So the dataset, like a section of yet-to-be-placed jigsaw puzzle, will remain there until we figure out how it connects to the larger image. It should also be noted that the hypothesis of abiogenesis is also in this current state. A bunch of large sections of the puzzle have been solved, but we have yet to figure out how all of those sections fit together, as we don't currently know what the final image even looks like or if we even have access to all of the pieces.
It doesn't follow from mass, charge, or spin. Nature can simulate intelligence without consciousness, so the emergence of minds with first-person awareness looks, from the standpoint of naturalism at least, deeply anomalous.
Nope, that doesn't follow either. And it's these kinds of hyperbolic and emotional takeaways that give the hard problem of consciousness a level of credence it doesn't really merit.
But if the foundation of reality is a personal mind, then the appearance of finite minds is not only unsurprising, it's what we would expect.
Welcome to the God of the Gaps, so long as you choose to define your specific God in such a specific way as to justify your specific assumptions about the ontological nature of qualia.
This is what philosophers call an inference to the best explanation.
Whoa there, Haas. Now you're just straight up lying to your audience. In philosophy, the inference to the best explanation is a form of inductive reasoning where one infers the truth of a hypothesis because it appears to provide the best explanation for the evidence of an observed phenomena. While not completely related, this form of inductive reasoning is often reinforced when one also holds to the principle of sufficient reason, or the PSR, which is a metaphysical principle that basically rejects the existence of brute facts and states that everything must have a reason, cause, or ground for the way it is, despite the fact that all worldviews invariably get hung up on one horn of the trilemma, brute facts being one of those horns. The problem, Erik, is that your best explanation, the God entity that you assert, is based entirely upon how you have subjectively defined that God entity, which means that you're deliberately ignoring all of the logically possible and more parsimonious explanations in favor of one that appeals to the cultural conditioning that has informed your subjective intuitions, which immediately demonstrates that your asserted best hypothesis cannot be the best one, as it's entirely predicated upon your individual bias and not anything you can demonstrate to be true in actual reality. This right here is the heart of the problem with top-down thinking, starting with a top assumption about the metaphysical or ontological nature of a thing, and then working downward so as to fit any evidence into supporting the initial assumption. In reality, the inference to the best explanation would be the hypothesis that what we call qualia is an emergent property of the brain.
We're not just asking how consciousness works. We're asking, given that it exists, which worldview does a better job making sense of it?
Given that the theistic worldview is begging the question at its very core, it would be the non-theistic worldview that supplies the best current explanation in alignment with the available evidence and parsimony.
On theism, consciousness fits naturally.
It doesn't, given that the only mechanistic explanation theists can provide for how their particular god does anything is pretty much just god magic.
On atheistic naturalism, it's a mystery bordering on a miracle.
Again, atheistic naturalism is not a comprehensive worldview. Non-theism is the worldview that you're representing with intellectual dishonesty, and it's not considered miraculous. It's considered a natural phenomenon that we don't currently have a total mechanistic explanation for. As I've told many a previous apologist, if lying about the position of the other side is required to give your own position more credence, then your own position never had any credence to begin with.
Now, some people will push back and say, you're just invoking God because you don't understand consciousness. That's just God of the Gaps.
So you are actually aware of the undefeated rebuttals from philosophers and cognitive scientists. Is there a reason beyond your emotional appeal for why you're ignoring them?
But that misses the point completely.
Does it? Because last I checked, the God of the Gaps critique is directly applied in response to the observed fact that the theist is attributing the mechanistic cause for qualia to a God entity. An entity, by the way, that they're begging the question of the existence of out of personal incredulity.
This isn't about what we don't know, it's about what we do know.
The hard problem of consciousness is concerned with the translation of physical processes to qualia. The only thing it's concerned with is what we don't currently know, because if we had that mechanistic explanation, then the problem wouldn't exist.
Consciousness is real, it's not a blank in our knowledge, it is a full-blown data point.
And no one on either side is arguing that.
And the question is, which worldview actually predicts the data?
No, that is not the question at all. That is what we call a ridiculous leap in logic. And it's your refusal to address the topic on its merits alone that tells me that you do likely understand all of the issues with the hard problem of consciousness that you can't account for, so to escape them, you have to jump to the assertion of a worldview that centers on the existence of a specific entity defined in a specific way in order to justify your unfounded ontological assumptions about the nature of qualia, and even then you can only point to God magic as being the mechanism behind the phenomenon itself. As far as philosophy goes, this is some Matt Powell tier argumentation, which means, Erik, you're either ignorant beyond a capacity for articulation, or you're just another grifting apologist preying upon the ignorance of others.
Appealing to God here isn't filling a gap.
It really is. Unless, of course, you can demonstrate that your specific God exists independently of mind and context without begging the question. I'll wait.
It's just recognizing that theism gives us a world where minds make sense, where they're actually expected.
Yeah, because that's how you've chosen to define your God so that you can justify certain assumptions about the nature of humans. And then you use that completely made-up entity to solve the hard problem of consciousness. That's called God of the Gaps. Which means you just contradicted yourself when you said that it wasn't. By the by, given that your God is a mental construct, you also just contradicted the very philosopher you cited, Colin McGill, whose position of new Mysterianism states that humans lack the mental capacity to actually solve the hard problem of consciousness, which of course would imply that anything that we can conceptualize as solving the problem, like the God entity that you yourself are conceptualizing, doesn't actually solve it.
Naturalism, on the other hand, gives us physics, particles, equations, and somehow that's supposed to spit out subjective experience? That's not a pathway, that's a leap.
Your personal incredulity is not our problem. We simply don't settle on an answer that appeals to emotion. We will, however, land on an answer that is supported by the evidence of the things that we have demonstrated access to. But until then, we won't make assertions as to what the explanation is. That's not a leap. That's intellectual honesty. What's really interesting, however, is how often intellectual honesty comes off as being problematic in your worldview.
And while critics throw around God of the Gaps, they quietly lean on their own version. Naturalism of the gaps.
That's only if the person is making a direct assertion as to what the mechanism is, which we currently don't. It's just the best current hypothesis. And seriously, man, I know you are, but what am I as an argument? What are you, fucking 5?
They have no mechanism, no model, just blind faith that science will one day stumble into a solution.
And you just contradicted yourself again. It would be naturalism of the gaps if someone was asserting a naturalistic mechanism that they couldn't demonstrate to be the case, which again, we don't do. But then you say that non-believers have faith that science will one day explain it, which is not naturalism of the gaps, because they're not asserting that a naturalistic explanation is in fact the case. And you're apparently too blind to realize that in your short-sighted attempt to drag intellectual honesty down to your level by falsely equating it with a faith position, all you actually did here was concede that your own faith position is irrational and therefore unjustified. Holy shit, man, you're bad at this.
Now, let's map out some of the main options. First, there's reductive materialism that says consciousness just is brain activity. Neurons fire and poof, experience. But that's just correlation masquerading as explanation.
Yes, that's the philosophical position that mental states are identical to or can be reduced to physical states of the brain. There's no logical or physical contradiction there. But it's important to remember that the philosophical position is not in the business of providing scientific explanations. That's the job of the scientific fields concerned with those phenomena. The only thing that's important is if there exists rational justification for holding the philosophical position, which for reductive materialism, also called type physicalism or identity theory of mind, there is. And the justification is derived from the evidence and the principles of parsimony.
Why should electricity be conscious of anything?
Again, no one is saying that the neuronal firing itself is what is conscious. If you can't even represent the topic accurately, it's best to simply not talk about it.
Why isn't your brain just a cold, unconscious calculator? Strong emergent says consciousness pops out when matter gets complex enough.
Yes, it's entirely possible and probable that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain.
But that just labels the problem without solving it.
That's because we're talking about philosophical positions, which again do not deal in providing scientific explanations for phenomena. If you want to talk about the justification for various philosophical positions, that's one thing. If you want to talk about what the science itself can explain, that's completely different. Stop conflating the two in this desperate attempt to sound profound.
Why does complexity create awareness at all? And if it adds something new, like mental properties with causal power, then you've left physicalism behind.
That also doesn't follow if you hold to the position that the brain is a part of the body itself, and that all the reactions expressed by the body are caused by the interactions occurring in the brain. This is really just a pathetic and obvious attempt to crowbar mind-body dualism into the argument. And we're going to go ahead and skip this last section because it's just him reiterating his God of the Gaps argument, while desperately trying to argue that it isn't a God of the Gaps argument. All in all, it's a sub-novice attempt to dodge the problematic entailments of his worldview so that he can speculate wildly about the ontological nature of various phenomena, falsely equate those speculations to current scientific understanding, and all while simultaneously misrepresenting the field of philosophy in order to emotionally manipulate his audience into accepting his particular narrative. That, or just sell them the personal validation their irrational worldview leaves them desperately craving. Now, when it comes to bridging the divide, I've become keenly aware that the depth of the philosophy surrounding these subjects can oftentimes come off as a non-starter. Just the act of wielding philosophical terminology as if everyone in the room is on the same page as you are can immediately crush any chance of productive dialogue. While it can aggravate those who know better, it more often alienates those who don't, and disincentivizes them from contributing to the conversation. But I will always be the first to tell you that when it comes to the field of apologetics, which itself deals not in evidence-backed explanations but in theology-based assertions, philosophy is often exposed for the double-edged sword that it can be. While deeper philosophical understanding can lend itself to helping one better grasp human reasoning and improve it through the identification of common errors, that very same knowledge can be used to skillfully obfuscate the deliberate commission of such errors in order to further a specific agenda. Fortunately, to recognize when that is happening requires only a basic understanding of philosophy itself. Understanding things like the laws of logic, basic fallacies, the difference between epistemology and ontology, and what theory of truth one personally subscribes to are more than enough to suss out any intellectual dishonesty in such presentations. With this basic knowledge, you'll be better able to recognize when someone is spewing complex yet unrelated bullshit in order to avoid actually addressing the topic at hand. And with that in mind, we can better bridge the divide by ensuring that our discussions yield productive, tangible results, instead of completely shutting them down in a vainglorious attempt to appear smarter than everyone else in the room. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you heard here and would like to support the channel further, links for channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear are also in the description. Once again, a massive thank you to all of you for your continuing support of the channel, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.